I wanted a place for people to receive authentic guidance and practical ways to awaken. Thought-provoking, paradigm-shifting, and empowering. This is about expanding our human consciousness to create a wave of new possibilities. I'm Dr. Theresa Bullard, and this is Quantum Minds TV. Welcome to Quantum Minds TV, where we take a deep dive into various perspectives on what it's going to take to create a shift in human consciousness. Now, today on the show, I'm honored and thrilled to have Dr. Shamini Jain joining me. Dr. Jain is a PhD scientist, psychologist, author, and teacher. She's the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Consciousness and Healing Initiative, or CHI, a collaborative accelerator of scientists, healers, artists, and educators to help lead humanity to heal themselves. She has received her bachelor's degree in neuroscience and behavior from Columbia University and her PhD from the University of San Diego and San Diego State University joint doctoral program in clinical psychology with a research focus in psychoneuroimmunology. She's received numerous awards for her published research studies in integrative health approaches, including Biofield healing and meditation. And Dr. Jain integrates her background in clinical psychology, psychoneuroimmunology, healing arts, vocal performance, and East Indian spiritual practice to share with others how they can best heal themselves into living a joyful and meaningful life. Dr. Shamini speaks and teaches in diverse venues, including TEDx, universities, healing conferences, all sorts of conferences, hospitals, and retreat centers. And her award-winning book with Soundstree Publications called Healing Ourselves, Biofield Science and the Future of Health is available now at bookstores worldwide. So welcome to Quantum Minds TV, Shamini, and thank you so much for being my distinguished guest today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, likewise, Theresa. It's going to be such a joy to dialogue together.
So, Shamini, you and I have been speaking at many of the same conferences together for a couple of years now. And I've also read your book. And I want to really, first of all, thank you personally for your dedication and your courage in really taking on this mission, bringing scientific credibility to the field of energy, medicine, and biofield healing therapies. And, I know just as a scientist as well, how difficult it is to start changing the dogma, so to speak, that has settled into science and medicine and so forth of the standard model. So I just really want to thank you. And I have a lot of admiration that you just kept on pushing and pushing and pushing to get the research, to get the funding. A lot of people don't realize how difficult it is actually to do the research into these alternative fields. So maybe we can actually start with you sharing a little bit about your journey of, having to kind of push against the grain to do all this research.
Thank you for the question, Theresa, because it is an important thing that people understand sometimes, especially in our community. Of course, there's such a thing as energy healing. Of course, there's distant healing in all of this. And for those of us who are really eager to get these healing practices into the hospitals and clinics, we have to look to and share the evidence as well. And then, like you, Theresa, I'm a scientist, so I've always been profoundly curious about this because I noticed effects for myself and I've noticed them in others. And I thought, well, we should be looking at this scientifically. And honestly, I call myself a naive optimist, in some ways, because I just went into it like any scientist would for the sheer, joy of curiosity of what do we know about the human condition and what do we know about healing? And so when I started uncovering, things from my own studies and then came across others who were doing work in this area, I began to then realize that there's still a stigma around this. And I can share with you a little bit about, the latest from my recent TEDx talk at Berkeley. And when I went through, with the TED curators there who flagged the talk on biofield science, I did a TEDx talk about almost 10 years ago, which was not flagged because I just touched on the biofield. But when I went straight in and shared the data and evidence, TED flagged the talk. So I've really been sitting with, we started our nonprofit, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, which is, as you know, that nonprofit collaborative to forward the science and practice of healing. It's been almost 10 years.
Wow.
since we founded this collaborative. And in some ways, I can sit back and say we've made a great amount of progress and we're really making some incredible strides in the research. I'm so excited for where the research is going. And yet it is interesting, in kind of line with what the theme of your show is about. What does it take to make that conscious shift as a planet? One thing that I'm coming across is that there is still a significant amount of resistance to sitting with the data.
Mhm.
And I'll just share with you, since you mentioned the book, honestly, the true story behind the book. The true story behind the book is that I had no intention of writing a book,
Mhm.
despite the fact that my father had been imploring me to write a book for almost 20 years. And it was during a podcast with Tammy Simon that before we started the podcast, and she's the founder of Sounds True, as you may know, and others may know, she said, Shamini, I have one question for you before we begin the podcast. Where is your book? And could Sounds True have a crack at publishing it? And I said, Tammy, I never thought about writing a book. Tell me why you think I should write one.
Mhm.
And she shared this very issue, right? Even from her perspective, that even with her sitting in the position that she's at, it sounds true, she would often get comments about people poo-pooing energy healing
Yeah.
and saying there was evidence behind it and whatever. And she said, look, I know there's evidence and you've been doing this for a long time. You're one of these people that could really pull it together and share the data.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's what I went through with my TEDx talk as well. Everyone was like, share the data. So then the question becomes, what happens when you share the data? And I know you have your own experiences with this. I still remember when we met, Theresa, that this beautiful meeting was actually just before we started the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. We
Yeah.
were just planning our first meeting then. And I was so taken by your perspective, which was unapologetically spiritual as well as scientific in those discussions,
Mhm.
and honestly, I think that's what it takes. So anyway, I can share more about what's going on with TED, for example, but I would say, to sum up with, the topic here, over the past, couple of decades that I've been noticing this evolution, and it is an evolution, it's an evolution in knowledge, it's an evolution in the way that we communicate about the evidence.
Mhm.
I think what keeps me going the most is the community that we have of spiritual scientists as well as practitioners that say, well, we understand that this may still seem strange to some of you or even unbelievable, but we're seeing these effects consistently happening
Mhm.
and we're going to pursue. So while I deeply appreciate your kind words, on my persistence, I will say there's a number of us, including you, that are really continuing to hold and grow this space. And that makes me really happy.
Well, thank you for all of that. One of the things with your book that I so appreciated was just like if anyone had any doubt that there's scientific evidence when it comes to biofield, energy healing and so forth. Uh, all they need to do is read your book, and you've got all the sources, all the reviews, all of the, you've compiled it together in one place. So it's like, here you go, just read this book and then do the digging yourself and dig into the research. Whereas so many people in science and medicine, because they're so rooted into a particular paradigm and dogma, they tend to just say, well, I don't believe it, so it can't be true. And I won't even look at the data because it's got to be false, right? Because it just challenges their paradigm so much that, and that's actually why I think when we met, I was unapologetically spiritual because I came to a point in my own pursuit with science and my own, during my PhD studies, I came to this place of realizing that while scientists are supposed to have really open minds and come without bias and just really assess the data and try to figure out how to explain it, that wasn't really what was happening. I found that there was often, at least in physics, there was a scientific dogma that had set in that people got just as attached to as certain people might get to a religious dogma, and and they based their careers upon it. And then when something came along to challenge it, they were very reluctant. And then, fair enough, they can say, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But then when you deliver that evidence, there's still this common theme that happens where they just dismiss it and they won't publish it. right? Like you've experienced this, Dean Raid has experienced this. They just won't publish it into the mainstream journals because it doesn't fit in with that narrative. Uh,
Absolutely.
and yet you've found ways to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this speaks to the recent experience I had with TED. And I do want people to know about this because it is important. So, some in the community may know that TED has banned and flagged talks by many of our colleagues.
Yeah.
But again, going in as a naive optimist, I'll just share, if you don't mind, the story behind this because it's so incredible, honestly.
Mhm.
So I was invited to give this TEDx Berkeley talk, and the curator that invited me knew very well what I did and was excited to share it. And I said, this is not considered a mainstream area. Is that okay? TED is pretty mainstream. And she said, yes, because you have the evidence base. And I think it's
Mhm.
important we share the evidence base. So as we're getting into it, as you know, this is TEDx Berkeley. So some of the curators were students. And as they got kind of more connected with what I was doing, they got a little concerned and they shared with me the TEDx curatorial guidelines. So these are guidelines that TED corporate gives to every TEDx,
Mhm.
group across the world. And in those guidelines, they say, here are some red flag areas. We're not saying you shouldn't do anything in these areas, but we're just saying be very, very careful if you decide to have speakers in these areas because we consider them red flag areas. Anything having to do with healing,
Wow.
anything having to do with placebo. And they literally write, beware of people trying to draw parallels between science and spirituality. So
Wow.
they give me these guidelines and I'm sitting with them and I said, are you sure you want me to give this talk? Like, at the time it's not. And they say, yeah, but just we have a couple of other pieces of information from them. They don't want you to say the word Reiki and they don't want you to say the word chi.
Oh my
And
gosh. And here
and
your nonprofit is CHI. Gee.
I know. So it's just, I mean, you can't do anything but laugh, right? So I wanted to laugh, but I just sat and I just smiled at them. And then they got nervous. They said, well, listen, we can't have you. And I said to them very calmly, I said, listen, we've been working on the script together, as people might know, you have to work on a script
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
TEDx folks. And I said, you've read the script. You know what it's about. I'm addressing the reasons why people can't intake this data, including cognitive dissonance, monocultural ethnocentrism. You've been having these conversations with me. And yet you're telling me that I shouldn't say the word Reiki or Chi because TED Corporate has a problem with it. I said, but I'm not giving this talk for TED Corporate. I'm giving it for the people so that they know what the actual reality is in the scientific data and what healing practitioners are saying about the practice. That's also very important.
Mm.
I told them, I said, I can't guarantee what's going to come out of my mouth. I just can't censor myself in that way. Well, as I gave the talk, it turned out I think I actually didn't end up saying those words, not on purpose. And, we thought the talk went very well, great reception. It was a live audience at, TEDx Berkeley, to a couple of thousand people, had, scientists from, who were working in cancer research, doctors, different people came up to me and, they really felt the impact from the talk. And as you probably, Theresa, several of them came up and said, I feel like I have more permission now to talk about this, which is a huge thing that I
Yeah.
want to point to in terms of what does it take to bring a consciousness shift. We have to
Right.
empower each other to talk about it.
Mm.
Anyway, months later, I find out that TED has not only released the talk without letting me know, they have flagged it and they changed the title
Gosh.
without telling me. So the title of the talk was We're Wired to Heal Each Other, the Science of Interconnection. And I
Oh,
go through both the neuroscience, and the psychoneuroimmunology, but then dive really deeply into biofield science as the next frontier, because this is what gives me such excitement about the biofield work is
yeah.
it's literally opening us up to the power of our healing interconnection across space, and some would say time, right? How powerful we are as human healing agents, and what a message of hope that is to a community, a global community that has been onslaughted by so much fear and panic from and isolation from the COVID epidemic and all of this, right? So that was really where I wanted to go with the talk. Anyway, they changed the title from We're Wired to Heal Each Other, the Science of Interconnection to a very blasé title, Health and Connection or Health and Interconnection.
Oh, gosh.
Without telling me they reached, and then on the flag, they say, I presented data and I gave them a reference list of about 30 peer-reviewed published studies that I talk about in my talk. And I mentioned that there are over 425 clinical studies of biofield healing therapies 125 randomized controlled trials, shared a lot of data beyond just my study. They wrote in their disclaimer or flag or whatever, this talk is just based on the speaker's personal research,
Yeah, oh gosh.
which is honestly false, right? So I'm still in dialogue with them because I don't agree with what they've done.
Mm.
I did a little more digging, Theresa, and what I found out, of course, is as we know, it's not just my talk.
Oh
They've
yeah.
done this Rupert's talk, they've done this, but they're even flagging talks on what we would consider mainstream topics like breathing.
Wow. Dare I say, I mean, you are in good company. I know when Rupert Sheldrake's talk got censored by them, like just outright censored and blacklisted, it started a big debate. And I remember, people, even like Deepak Chopra got involved in it, and there was a big debate that started happening. And a part of what came out at the time was that on the board, I don't know if it's the advisory board, directors board, but on the board of TED Talks, were several devout materialist atheists, and they're on a mission. You see the same thing happening on Wikipedia, for example. They're on a mission to discredit, to censor, to make fun of anyone who starts to talk into any kind of virtue or reality or true possibilities of spirituality, mysticism, energy healing, all of these things. And dare I say, your experience with people like doctors and scientists and practitioners coming up to you saying, wow, thank you, I really felt that, and it gives me more permission to actually feel like this is okay to talk about. Dare I say that whoever it is that's behind some of these mainstream things like TED Talks and Wikipedia don't want that conversation coming out. They're actively working very difficult to stop that conversation from coming, because that conversation is going to put the power back in the people's hands.
Exactly.
To know that they can heal themselves, that they can change their lives, that they're not bound to the pharmaceuticals, for example, or to whatever authorities outside of them. It's inside. And that completely changes the narrative that runs our world right now.
You're so on point with that, Theresa. It's so true. And I'd like to encourage everybody, everyone who's listening to us today and otherwise, all of us have this power to share the light of our presence, first and foremost, right? Any of our own teachings, our practices, and the science. And I want to remind people, some people may know, for example, here in the United States, we have the National Institutes of Health and then several divisions or centers that come out of that. One of them that developed first from the Office of Alternative Medicine became a full-fledged center for complementary and alternative medicine called NCAM, which is now called NCCIH. It's evolved into National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. But when that effort began, it actually began because of public demand. It did not begin with NIH saying we need to develop a center, but rather it took public demand to actually put pressure on the legislators and the congressmen and congresswomen to say, we need to create this center for research and education in integrative practices and health-related practices. So it absolutely will continue to be a grassroots effort. And we're all involved. So some of us, like you and me, are out front. We've had the privilege of obtaining our PhDs, doing research in the area, being able to share it from that level of, depth and detail from our own research and talk to certain folks in the audience. But each of us are interacting with people every day. So, while TED, Wikipedia, as you mentioned, some of these, folks are sort of orchestrating around excluding this conversation because they can't really monetize healing, and, God forbid when they figure out how, and, as you and I know, there are ways people, do that. We have to be very vigilant that we're continuing to share among each other, like, with this program, for example.
Yeah. And so I'd love to dive into, a little more so that people who are listening can really understand. I mean, I didn't mean to get into a political debate about what's going on, but I do think it's important about for people to be aware that they need to discern. Typically, they think these are the credible and trustworthy sources, but some like Wikipedia, everyone goes to Wikipedia when they're starting to search, on some kind of, instead of going to the old encyclopedia, it's Wikipedia now. And yet these have a very biased spin. They didn't start out that way, but they have been overtaken because they got so popular. But I love what you said about the grassroots movement, because we've seen that same thing be what has driven, for example, more and more greening of our world. Like more companies and corporations are having to show how they're somehow going green, or how they're somehow being giving back into the community, or how more organic foods and whole foods and various dietary sensitivity kind of opportunities or offerings are being made available, and that's because people are demanding it. So I love that people were starting to demand more complementary and integrative medicine, and more of a real look at the possibility of energy healing and so forth, as something that the NIH even should start considering and investing in. So I hadn't even known that they had that until I was reading it in your book. It's like, oh wow, there actually was some funding from the NIH to go towards this, which is fantastic. And so the biofield, right? We've talked energy healing and so forth, but let's define for people who aren't really familiar with the biofield, what that actually is, so that we can dive deeper into this conversation.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. And the biofield, first of all, is a Western-based term. It's a term that was coined by Western scientists, actually at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, around 1992. So almost, 20, 30 years ago. And it was described then as a massless field, not necessarily electromagnetic, that guides the homeodynamic functioning of a living organism. So what does that mean in English? Like,
Very scientific terminology there.
very, very scientific term. Scientists coined the term, right? What are we talking about? We're talking about fields of energy and information that can guide our health. And that's really the upshot. That's what we're discovering from the data. And what's so cool about it is, from a scientific perspective, we can look at the biofield of a cell and actually explore the electromagnetic readouts of a cell, look at the biofield between cells as it relates to cell-cell communication, and even things like growing new neural tissue, which maybe we can get into, some fantastic work going on there. We can look at the biofield of a person, and we're just beginning to do that. Some ways we have known forever, like measuring heart and brain organ systems through the EEG and the EKG, for example. That's not controversial, measuring electromagnetic readouts of the organ systems. We look at biophoton emission. That's happening more and more, just beginning to understand what biophoton emission may mean from the systems level as emitted by a person. But there's a lot of data already looking at biophoton emission from cells, for example. That's part of the biofield. And we know that biophoton emission is related to inflammatory states and redox reactions in cells and related to cancer. So those are some ways that we look at the biofield in these sort of electromagnetic ways. And we can even look at the biofield of the earth. And we have many colleagues, as you know, that do this. We look at the resonances of the earth. We look at the shifts in resonances in the earth. We look at the effects of planetary energies on the earth, including solar flares. But what's very neat about the biofield is it's not like we're just having to study these discrete things, like just the cell or just the person. We actually look at the interconnection. So we can look at the biofield between a person and the earth, for example, and how does connecting with the earth energetically actually foster my health? We can look at the biofield between people and look at these more subtle aspects of energy and information that we can't, to date, measure reliably. We cannot, people always ask, can we measure chi? Can we measure prana? To my knowledge, no, not directly. And I don't know if we ever will, but we can measure reverberations of prana and chi. We can study healing practices, and we have in depth, and we'll get into maybe some of that data later. So there are all these ways of exploring the fields of energy and information that guide our health. And, there are devices too, where we put energy into a system or a person, for example, to stimulate a healing response. But here's what I find some key takeaways from the work of Biofield and why I think it matters and why it's so exciting. One, as we talked about, it's really showing us the power of interconnection, that
Mm,
our interconnection is a reality. And the biofield shows us that we're just not these discrete physical systems and physical skins, physical dense bodies, where we're just interacting behaviorally through talking. There's a whole layer of communication that's always going on between us.
mm,
Always. We're never alone. So that's a beautiful takeaway from the research, no matter what research you're looking at. Um, yeah, and the other is just simply that we we are spirit in human form, because what and that healing is something that is happening not to us, but it's a process. It's
mm,
not an outcome. And all of these healing practices are simply bringing us back to our spiritual nature, to the healing force within us, to
mm.
guide the harmony and balance again within us and between us for health and healing. So those are some of the takeaways, so far from studying the biofield. That's why I find it so exciting.
Mm. Oh my God, there's so much that you just said there that I absolutely love. I love how you said it, the takeaways. There's a lot to dive into there, and hopefully we'll get to, kind of revisit some of that as we go through our conversation. So I want to just kind of take a look here at the biofield. So we have electric energy. So for example, if you just, we have atoms on our, on our skin, the cells and so forth. But if we just create friction between our hands, we ionize the atoms and so forth on our skin, which then can create an electric, and you can actually feel that, right? We all seen where you clap your hands together, rub it really fast, and then, you'll start to feel just the ionic energy, which is very physical. There's a very much a physics explanation for it. And then as you move it, you create a magnetic field, right? And so we know from EEGs and electrodes and skin conductance and these types of things that there is electrical energy that runs through our bodies, but it also emanates out from our bodies. Then we know that there's magnetic energy and electromagnetic, they go hand in hand, but they're also in science, they're measured in different ways. So we have the magnetic like cardiograms, for example, that are measuring the heart's field now, and they're using it to image what might be going on with the heart. So we know just from the fact that we have this technology today for imaging, what's happening with the heart, that therefore the magnetic energy of the heart actually is expanding off the body, because those don't touch the body like the electrodes often do. And then, so I'm going to shift for a second from my scientist hat to my healer hat. As a healer, as someone who's worked with the energy field, my experience has come to show me that just as complex as our physical body is, if you did an autopsy into the physical body and you have all these intricacies and all these different systems, and, you kind of have to work your way through the different systems and be careful not to, if a surgeon was going in to fix, somebody's organ, they have to be careful. They have to move a lot of other systems out of the way in order to get to what they need. And it's a very intricate system. And just as complex as our physical body is, the energy field has that much complexity as well. There's layers upon layers. There's various frequency levels. It's not just electric. It's not just magnetic. There's elements. There's what might be called etheric energy. There's all these different energies. We hear about the chakras, we hear about the aura, the different layers and layers and layers of that. So I feel like another takeaway that comes from opening ourselves up to the reality and possibilities of the biofield and biofield healing, and how medicine might transform as a result of accepting biofield healing, is that it starts to realize that we are multidimensional beings, multi-vibrational beings. There's so many more layers and levels. When it comes to disease right now, we're just approaching it from the physical, the chemical, the biological. But what if the cause of that disease is happening in the mental or the emotional or the energetic field and the higher aspects of the soul? And we can treat at a physical level, but if we're not actually addressing things at those higher aspects of oneself, where the real source of it resides, then we're barely maintaining. and so true healing can come when we start to really look at the energetic field, at the biofield, and the power of the spirit embodied into the physical, the power of consciousness, intention, and how we direct our mind and our intentions in a way that beneficially, impact us versus negatively impact us. Because people's minds are affecting them one way or another, whether they're being conscious and intentional of that or not. As we've seen through, for example, some of the epigenetic studies that have also come in. So I don't know if you want to comment on any of that, but
Yeah, no, I think this is really key. And one of the things that came up for me when you were chatting about this is the understanding that we're multidimensional beings. And one of the places too that the biofield science work, which is conducted, the work that I've been talking about so far has been conducted mostly by Western researchers, is a return back to the indigenous systems of healing across the world and what they said about the nature of the human. And, Teresa, coming from, culturally from India, and, being born and raised in the Jan tradition, I'm keenly aware of the different subtle bodies that were described in Janism, for example, and not just in Janism, but in other traditions. So there was a sense of the physical body, of course. Many people are familiar with the five koshas and, in yoga. In Jainism, there is actually also a discussion about the translocation body, different bodies that can actually astrally project for particular spiritual purposes that only adept practitioners can work with. So there was always an understanding of the multidimensionality of human beings and the role of the spirit in human life as well as in healing. And one of the things that I mentioned in my book and I talk about is how do we put these things together? One of the pieces of feedback that I get sometimes from lay people who read the book is, you finally put it together for me. Like, I never really thought about how energy healing was related to some of these ancient systems and understandings like karma, for example. So in my book, I break this down further, but when we look at the subtle body, or whether we call it the subtle bodies, depending on whether we're looking at this as singular and plural, we see that we're at different levels of density, and it's interesting because in the Jan tradition, they actually talk about these subtle bodies being non-physical, but very dense. So actually these subtle bodies are more dense in nature because there's more, stuff. It's just not necessarily physical. Like it's a very subtle aspect. But the key is that they really serve as a bridge between the light of your spirit, unbounded consciousness, so this is where again, oneness, non-duality plays a role and understanding how does the biofield kind of relate to non-duality. When most of us aren't talking about that yet, but from these ancient traditions, there's a very deep connection here because let's just say the etheric body for the sake of saying it, and some correspondences with the etheric body in these traditions are things that are called the sukshma sharir, subtle body, taija sharir, which is the fiery body, with the karmic body. So the taija sharir and the karma sharir in Jainism come together to form the subtle body, which is the sukshma sharir, which is probably correspondent with what we call the etheric body in the West, as far as I can tell. Well, it's a bidirectional communication system between the spirit and our mind, emotions, and physicality. So, what does that all mean? From these traditions, what it means is that everything we think, everything that we do, everything that we cause to make happen in the world is imprinted in some way subtly on our system. And that imprint serves as like a filter. So we can see the imprints. Some healers can see or feel the imprints in the subtle body. And as you say, when we work with this in a subtle way, we may be able to release what have been called vasanas or sanskaras or, whatever impressions, karmic impressions in the field, if you will. Maybe some that we just don't need anymore, right? And when we do that, that allows for, from these traditions, the light of our soul, the light of our consciousness to spread itself more fully throughout our multidimensional system. So that consciousness in its unbounded form is guiding the way a little more strongly than, say, it were if we were stuck in those conditioned responses where we have all these karmic impressions. We're going to have karmic impressions if we're human. It's just the nature of being human. It's the beauty of being human, too, because we have this agency. We have this potential to dive into the subtle awareness ourselves or with guidance, right? and take note of that impression, even if it's ancestral, right? I mean, sometimes we carry this in our ancestry sometimes too, these impressions, right? How do we heal that? Well, it's entirely possible. That's what these traditions tell us. So it's so empowering, when it comes to our spiritual development, to understand the role of the biofield in this way.
Wow, so much you just said again. That was great. If I can just parallel, because I, as you were sharing more from the Eastern tradition and the subtle bodies, like I can compare that, to some of the Western tradition with in the Kabbalistic system, for example, that I study with. There's the oneness or the non-dual state, which is in this eternal realm where our spirit, our eternal self resides, and that spirit, that oneness state, to come from that ultimate purity into this infinite diversity that we experience here in the physical, it has to go through many different density levels or vibrational levels in order to work its way down. And like the soul body in the Kabbalistic system is actually a mediator between the spirit and the physical. And within the tree of life, the soul body actually has 7 different dimensions or aspects or components to it, which could be these different bodies. And then, the energy kind of traverses from one to another. They also act as both, they transmit the energy or emanate it to the next level, but they also conceal the energy from that highest, purest state. They conceal it gradually so that by the time it comes into the physical can actually contain it without short circuiting. But sometimes those the functions of those aspects of those bodies get distorted from wounding of past, or you're talking karmic or ancestral, or or collective consciousness wounding, and that can influence the functionality of our own mediating bodies that help to bring the energy from spirit down to the physical, which makes it difficult for us to also really perceive that higher wisdom and insight guidance and the fullness of the spirit consciousness trying to come in and direct us when it's distorted because of these woundings. And so, again, like in the Kabbalistic system, the physical is very important, but it is the receptacle into which all these higher energies are poured in and embodied, but it's not the cause. It's the result. And in order to truly heal and go through this journey of, in Kabbalah, they call it tikkun, a rectification, a repair. In order to go through this, we have to look into those higher realms and dimensions and aspects of ourselves, which, we can do some degree of that through our psychology. And we can do another degree of that through just healing emotionally, which psychology can help. But then there's higher aspects of the soul that really we have to rely on energy healing and meditation and spiritual practices and these types of things to help us lift up and raise our consciousness. We always have access to it, but we need to put in the practices and the effort to actually do the alchemy, if you will, to raise the vibration and the consciousness to these higher realms. And when we do, we tap into that source that then allows for a higher level of healing to come in at those higher bodies. Join us again as we continue to dive deeper into this fascinating conversation with Dr. Shamini Jain on the next episode of Quantum Minds TV.
This conscious conversation was created, produced, and recorded by Dr. Theresa Bullard in collaboration with Dr. Shamini Jain and edited by Verse Content and Depth Perception Films. The theme music and intro videography were created by Tim Mountain of Even Mode Productions. Quantum Minds TV is a product of the Quantum Learning Academy.